Welcome to another journey through the quiet corridors of history. Tonight, we drift back to the early 14th century, to a vast lake system in the heart of what we now call Mexico. Here, amidst the gentle lapping of waters against wooden posts, an extraordinary agricultural innovation was taking root. The Aztec floating gardens, known as chinampas, would become one of history's most remarkable farming systems, feeding an empire that stretched across Mesoamerica. Settle in comfortably as we explore this fascinating chapter of human ingenuity, told at a pace as gentle as the waters that once surrounded Tenochtitlan. The story of the chinampas is not one of conquest or drama, but of patient cultivation, careful planning, and the quiet triumph of agricultural science over geographical challenge. In the shallow waters of Lake Texcoco, Lake Xochimilco, and Lake Chalco, indigenous farmers developed a system so efficient and sustainable that it supported a population density rivaling that of contemporary European cities. Yet, this achievement came not through grand gestures or sudden revelations, but through generations of careful observation, gradual refinement, and the kind of persistent dedication that history often overlooks in favor of more dramatic narratives. The floating gardens were not, as their name might suggest, gardens that literally floated on the water's surface. Rather, they were carefully constructed artificial islands, built up from the lake bottom using a methodical process that would have appeared almost meditative to outside observers. Layer by layer, sediment by sediment, these fertile plots emerged from the shallow waters, creating a landscape that was both natural and artificial, both ancient and innovative. To understand the chinampas, we must first understand the world in which they were created. The Valley of Mexico, sitting at an elevation of over 7,000 feet above sea level, was once home to a series of interconnected lakes. These bodies of water, formed by volcanic activity and sustained by mountain runoff, created a unique ecosystem that would prove perfect for the development of intensive agriculture. Lake Texcoco, the largest of these water bodies, occupied the central depression of the valley. Its waters were slightly saline, fed by underground springs that carried dissolved minerals from the surrounding volcanic soil. To the south lay Lake Xochimilco and Lake Chalco, their waters fresher and more suitable for agriculture. These southern lakes would become the primary sites for chinampa construction, their shallow depths and rich sediments providing ideal conditions for the floating gardens. The climate of the Valley of Mexico was temperate year-round, with distinct wet and dry seasons that influenced the rhythm of agricultural life. During the rainy months, from May through October, the lakes would swell with fresh water, cascading down from the surrounding mountains. The dry season, stretching from November through April, brought cooler temperatures and lower water levels, creating optimal conditions for planting and harvesting. The geological foundation of the region played a crucial role in the success of the chinampa system. Volcanic activity had deposited layers of rich, fertile soil throughout the valley, creating sediments that were dense with nutrients. When these materials settled to the bottom of the lakes, they formed a deep layer of organic matter that would become the building blocks of the floating gardens. Indigenous peoples had inhabited this region for thousands of years before the rise of the Aztec Empire. Archaeological evidence suggests that early forms of wetland agriculture were practiced as far back as 100 CE, with sophisticated drainage and cultivation systems already in place when the first Aztec settlers arrived in the valley. These earlier inhabitants had learned to work with the natural rhythms of the lakes, developing techniques for managing water levels and soil composition that would later be refined and expanded by the Aztecs. The hydrological system of the valley was complex and interconnected. Springs bubbling up from underground sources provided a constant flow of fresh water, while seasonal rains replenished the lakes and carried fresh sediments from the mountains. This natural circulation system created an environment where nutrients were constantly being redistributed, supporting the rich biodiversity that characterized the region. Native plant life thrived in this aquatic environment. Cattails, rushes, and other marsh plants grew in abundance along the shorelines and in the shallow areas of the lakes. These plants would prove essential to chinampa construction, providing both structural materials and sources of organic matter for soil building. The lakes also supported diverse populations of fish, birds, and other aquatic life, creating a complex ecosystem that would be carefully integrated into the agricultural system. Early agricultural innovations. Long before the establishment of the great city of Tenochtitlan, indigenous farmers in the Valley of Mexico had begun experimenting with wetland agriculture. The earliest attempts at cultivation in the lake environment were simple and straightforward, involving the creation of small raised fields in naturally shallow areas where the water table was close to the surface. These early farmers observed that plants grew exceptionally well in areas where rich lake sediments had been disturbed and piled above the waterline. They noticed that the constant moisture from the underlying water table eliminated the need for irrigation, while the nutrient-rich sediments provided ideal growing conditions for crops like maize, beans, and squash. The first proto-chinampas were likely created by accident, formed when natural processes deposited sediments in particular patterns, or when human activities, like fishing and hunting, disturbed the lake bottom in ways that created slightly elevated areas. Observant farmers would have noticed the superior growth of wild plants in these locations and begun deliberately creating similar conditions for their crops. The transition from simple raised fields to true chinampas represented a gradual evolution in agricultural technique. Early farmers began experimenting with different methods of sediment collection and placement, learning which types of organic matter decomposed most effectively and which structural materials provided the best foundation for their artificial islands. The process of early chinampa construction was labor-intensive but methodical. Farmers would wade into the shallow waters of the lakes, using simple tools to scrape nutrient-rich mud from the lake bottom. This sediment would be carefully transported and deposited in rectangular patterns, with each layer allowed to settle and compact before the next was added. The process required patience and careful attention to detail, as the emerging gardens needed to maintain structural integrity while providing optimal growing conditions. Willow trees played a crucial role in these early agricultural innovations. Young willow saplings were planted around the perimeter of each emerging garden, their roots growing down through the artificial soil and into the lake bottom below. As these trees matured, their root systems created a living framework that held the chinampa together, preventing erosion and providing structural stability that could last for generations. The spacing and layout of early chinampas followed practical considerations rather than grand design principles. Gardens were typically constructed as long, narrow rectangles, oriented to take advantage of prevailing wind patterns and water currents. This shape maximized the edge-to-interior ratio, ensuring that all plants had access to the moisture and nutrients provided by the surrounding water. Crop selection in these early floating gardens was based on both practical considerations and cultural preferences. Maize formed the foundation of the agricultural system, its deep roots helping to stabilize the artificial soil while its tall stalks provided structure for climbing beans. Squash plants spread across the garden surfaces, their broad leaves helping to retain moisture and prevent soil erosion. The rise of Tenochtitlan. The founding of Tenochtitlan in 1325 CE marked a turning point in the development of chinampa agriculture. According to Aztec legend, the wandering Mexica people had been searching for a homeland, guided by their god Huitzilopochtli, who had instructed them to establish their city where they found an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. This prophetic vision was fulfilled on a small island in Lake Texcoco, where the Mexica established what would become the capital of the most powerful empire in Mesoamerica. The location chosen for Tenochtitlan presented both opportunities and challenges. The island site provided natural defenses against potential enemies, while the surrounding waters offered abundant resources for fishing and hunting. However, the rocky, swampy terrain was not naturally suited to large-scale agriculture. The growing population of the new city would require innovative solutions to provide adequate food supplies. The Mexica, who would later be known as the Aztecs, brought with them knowledge of wetland agriculture gained from their interactions with other indigenous groups in the valley. However, the scale of their urban ambitions required significant improvements to existing techniques. The chinampa system would need to be expanded and refined to support not just small farming communities, but a major metropolitan center with tens of thousands of inhabitants. Early efforts to establish chinampas around Tenochtitlan focused on the southern reaches of Lake Texcoco, where the water was fresher and the sediments richer. Aztec engineers carefully studied the water flow patterns around their new city, identifying areas where natural currents deposited the finest, most nutrient-rich sediments. These locations became the sites for the first major chinampa developments under Aztec direction. The construction of chinampas near Tenochtitlan required careful coordination between multiple groups of workers. Specialized teams were responsible for different aspects of the process, some focused on sediment collection and transport, others on the placement and shaping of garden plots, and still others on the planting and care of the willow trees that would anchor each artificial island. The Aztec approach to chinampa construction differed from earlier efforts in its systematic organization and standardized techniques. Rather than allowing individual farmers to develop gardens according to their own preferences, Aztec administrators established guidelines for garden size, layout, and construction methods. This standardization made it possible to create extensive networks of chinampas that could be managed efficiently and integrated into the broader economic system of the growing empire. The expansion of Tenochtitlan created an ever-increasing demand for food, driving continuous innovation in chinampa design and management. Aztec farmers experimented with different crop rotations, planting schedules, and cultivation techniques, always seeking ways to maximize productivity while maintaining soil fertility. The competitive environment of the growing city encouraged agricultural innovation, as successful farmers could achieve significant economic and social advancement. The integration of chinampas into the broader urban landscape of Tenochtitlan required careful planning and engineering. Canals were dug to connect the floating gardens with the main transportation networks of the city, allowing farmers to move their produce efficiently to urban markets. These waterways also served as sources of irrigation water and provided channels for the removal of waste products that could be used as fertilizer in the gardens. Engineering the floating gardens. The construction of a chinampa was a methodical process that could take several months to complete, depending on the size and complexity of the intended garden. The work began during the dry season, when water levels were at their lowest and the underlying lake bottom was most accessible to workers wading in the shallow areas. The first step in chinampa construction involved careful site selection. Experienced farmers would survey potential locations, looking for areas with the right depth of water, appropriate soil composition on the lake bottom, and favorable current patterns. The ideal site would have water deep enough to provide consistent moisture but shallow enough to allow workers to stand comfortably while building up the garden structure. Once a suitable location had been identified, workers began the process of marking out the boundaries of the future chinampa. Using wooden stakes and rope, they would outline a rectangular plot, typically measuring between 15 and 30 meters in length and 2 to 3 meters in width. The long, narrow shape was practical for several reasons. It maximized the amount of garden edge in contact with water, provided efficient drainage, and made it easier for farmers to reach all parts of the garden from the surrounding canals. The actual construction process began with the collection of organic materials from the lake bottom. Workers used specially designed tools called koas, which were essentially long-handled scoops, to gather nutrient-rich sediment from the deepest parts of the marked area. This material, consisting of decomposed plant matter, silt, and organic debris, formed the foundation layer of the chinampa. The sediment was carefully distributed within the marked boundaries, creating an initial layer about 30 centimeters thick. This base layer was then allowed to settle and compact for several days, during which time workers would gently walk across the surface to encourage even settling and identify any areas that needed additional material. Subsequent layers were added using a combination of lake sediment and organic matter gathered from other sources. Cattail reeds, water hyacinth, and other aquatic plants were harvested from around the lake and incorporated into the growing structure. These plant materials served multiple purposes. They added organic matter that would decompose and enrich the soil, they provided structural integrity to prevent erosion, and they created air pockets that improved drainage and root development. The layering process continued until the chinampa surface rose approximately 1 meter above the water level. This height was crucial for preventing flooding during the rainy season while ensuring that plant roots could still access the water. Table below. The final surface layer consisted of the finest, richest sediment. Available, often mixed with composted organic matter to create optimal growing conditions. Around the perimeter of each chinampa, workers planted young willow saplings at regular intervals. These trees, known as ahujotes, were chosen for their rapid growth, flexible root systems, and ability to thrive in wet conditions. As the willows established themselves, their roots grew down through the artificial soil and into the lake bottom, creating a living framework that held the entire structure together. The spacing between individual chinampas was carefully calculated to allow for efficient water circulation while maximizing the total area available for cultivation. Canals typically measured between 1 and 2 meters in width, providing enough space for canoes to navigate while ensuring that all garden plots had adequate access to water and nutrients. Agricultural techniques and crop management. The agricultural practices employed on the chinampas represented a sophisticated understanding of plant biology, soil chemistry, and ecological relationships. Aztec farmers had developed techniques that maximized productivity while maintaining the long-term fertility of their artificial soils, creating a sustainable system that could support intensive cultivation year after year. Crop rotation formed the backbone of chinampa agriculture, with farmers carefully planning sequences of plantings that would optimize soil nutrients and minimize pest problems. The basic rotation cycle typically involved 3 main crops: maize, beans, and squash, which together formed what modern agriculturalists recognize as a highly effective companion planting system. Maize was usually planted first, its deep roots helping to break up and aerate the soil while its tall stalks provided structure for climbing bean plants. The corn plants were spaced in regular rows across the chinampa surface, with seeds planted at carefully calculated intervals to ensure optimal growth without overcrowding. Aztec farmers had developed numerous varieties of maize suited to different growing conditions and harvest times, allowing them to maintain continuous production throughout the growing season. Bean plants were typically planted alongside the maize, their climbing vines using the corn stalks for support. The beans served multiple functions in the agricultural system. They provided protein-rich food, their root systems fixed nitrogen from the atmosphere and enriched the soil, and their dense foliage helped suppress weed growth. Different varieties of beans were selected for their climbing habits, nutritional content, and storage characteristics. Squash plants occupied the ground level of the chinampa, their broad leaves spreading across the soil surface to retain moisture and prevent erosion. The large leaves also helped suppress weed growth, while the extensive root system of the squash plants helped hold the artificial soil together. Various types of squash were cultivated, from small summer varieties eaten fresh to large winter squashes that could be stored for months. Beyond the basic triad of maize, beans, and squash, chinampa farmers cultivated an impressive variety of crops. Chili peppers added flavor and nutrition to the Aztec diet, while their compact growth habits made them ideal for intensive cultivation. Tomatoes, both the large varieties familiar today and smaller wild types, were grown extensively. Amaranth provided protein-rich seeds that could be ground into flour or popped like modern popcorn. Flowers held special significance in Aztec culture and were extensively cultivated. On the chinampas, marigolds were grown not only for their beauty but also for their practical benefits as companion plants that repelled insects and added organic matter to the soil when composted. Other flowering plants included various species of sunflowers, zinnias, and native varieties that had both ornamental and practical uses. The timing of planting and harvesting activities followed a complex calendar that took into account seasonal weather patterns, lunar cycles, and cultural requirements. Aztec farmers had developed detailed knowledge of microclimates within the lake system, understanding how factors like wind patterns, water temperature, and sunlight exposure varied across different areas of the chinampas. Seed selection represented another area of sophisticated agricultural knowledge. Farmers carefully selected seeds from the best-performing plants each season, gradually developing varieties that were perfectly adapted to chinampa conditions. This process of selective breeding, carried out over many generations, resulted in crop varieties that were highly productive, disease-resistant, and well-suited to the unique growing environment of the floating gardens. Water management on the chinampas required constant attention and skill. While the surrounding lake water provided consistent moisture, farmers needed to regulate water levels to prevent both drought stress and waterlogging. Small channels and ditches were dug throughout each garden to control drainage, while temporary dams and barriers could be used to redirect water flow as needed. Fertilization of the chinampas involved the careful recycling of organic materials from throughout the Aztec agricultural system. Human waste from the city was collected and composted before being applied to the gardens, providing essential nutrients while maintaining sanitary conditions. Kitchen scraps, crop residues, and aquatic plants were also composted and incorporated into the soil to maintain fertility. Daily life in the Chinampa communities. Life in the Chinampa communities followed rhythms dictated by the agricultural calendar and the natural cycles of the lake ecosystem. Farmers typically rose before dawn, beginning their work in the cool morning hours when the air was still and the water calm. The early morning was considered the optimal time for many agricultural tasks, from transplanting seedlings to harvesting mature crops. The workday began with a careful inspection of the gardens, as farmers checked each plot for signs of pest damage, disease, or other problems that might require attention. This daily monitoring was essential for maintaining the health and productivity of the chinampas, allowing farmers to address issues before they became serious threats to the crops. Transportation throughout the Chinampa networks relied entirely on canoes, which served as the primary means of moving people, tools, and harvested crops from garden to garden and from the agricultural areas to urban markets. These boats were typically carved from single tree trunks, shaped and balanced for stability in the shallow waters of the canal system. Skilled canoe operators could navigate the narrow waterways with remarkable efficiency, pulling their vessels through areas too shallow for paddling and maneuvering around obstacles with practiced ease. The construction and maintenance of canoes represented a specialized craft. Within the Chinampa communities, boat builders selected appropriate trees, often from the willow groves that bordered the gardens, and used traditional techniques to hollow out and shape the vessels. The finished canoes needed to be both lightweight for easy handling and durable enough to withstand daily use in the sometimes rough waters of the lake system. Family structures within Chinampa communities were typically organized around agricultural work, with multiple generations often living and working together on adjacent plots. Children learned farming techniques from an early age, beginning with simple tasks like seed planting and weed removal before gradually taking on more complex responsibilities as they matured. The knowledge required for successful Chinampa agriculture was passed down through families, with each generation adding their own innovations and improvements to traditional techniques. Women played crucial roles in Chinampa agriculture, often specializing in particular aspects of crop production such as seed selection, plant breeding, and post-harvest processing. They were frequently responsible for maintaining kitchen gardens where herbs, medicinal plants, and special varieties of food crops were cultivated. Women also typically managed the complex processes of food preservation and storage that were essential for maintaining adequate nutrition. Throughout the year, the social organization of Chinampa communities reflected the cooperative nature of wetland agriculture. While individual families might own and manage specific garden plots, many activities required collaborative effort. The construction of new chinampas, the maintenance of canal systems, and the organization of harvest activities all involved coordinated work by multiple families and community groups. Markets and trade relationships connected the Chinampa communities with the broader Aztec economy. Farmers would load their canoes with fresh produce in the early morning hours, paddling through the canal networks to reach the great marketplace of Tlatelolco or smaller local markets throughout the region. The timing of these trips was carefully coordinated to ensure that crops reached consumers at peak freshness, maximizing both quality and economic return. The seasonal rhythms of Chinampa life created distinct periods of intense activity, alternating with quieter times devoted to maintenance and preparation. During planting season, entire communities might work together to prepare soil, sow seeds, and establish new crops across hundreds of garden plots. Harvest times brought similar bursts of coordinated activity, as crops needed to be gathered quickly to prevent spoilage and ensure optimal quality. Religious and cultural activities were closely integrated with agricultural practices. In Chinampa communities, Ceremonies marking important points in the agricultural calendar, such as planting and harvest festivals, brought communities together in celebration and reinforced social bonds. These events also serve practical purposes, providing opportunities to share information about successful techniques, coordinate community projects, and resolve disputes that might arise over water rights or garden boundaries. Ecological integration and biodiversity. The chinampa system created a unique artificial ecosystem that supported remarkable biodiversity while maintaining intensive agricultural production. This integration of human agriculture with natural ecological processes represented one of the most sophisticated examples of sustainable farming in the pre-industrial world. The aquatic environment surrounding the chinampas provided habitat for numerous species of fish, which played important roles in the overall agricultural system. These fish helped control mosquito populations by consuming larvae, reducing pest problems that might otherwise have plagued the crops. Fish also served as a protein source for farming families and contributed nutrients to the system through their waste products, which fertilized the water and ultimately enriched the garden soils. Bird populations thrived in the chinampa landscape, taking advantage of the diverse habitats created by the combination of open water, marsh plants, and cultivated crops. Waterfowl nested in the reedy areas between gardens, while insectivorous birds helped control agricultural pests by feeding on harmful insects. The presence of diverse bird populations also provided farmers with additional food sources through hunting and egg collection. The plant communities that developed around and within the chinampa system were remarkably complex, including both cultivated crops and wild species that grew spontaneously in the rich, moist environment. These wild plants often served useful functions, providing materials for construction, medicine, or food, while also contributing to soil stability and nutrient cycling. Aquatic plants formed a particularly important component of the chinampa ecosystem. Cattails, rushes, water lilies, and other wetland species grew abundantly in the canals and shallow areas around the gardens. These plants served multiple functions. Their roots helped prevent erosion of the canal banks. Their biomass provided raw materials for construction and crafts, and their presence supported diverse populations of aquatic insects and other small organisms that formed the base of the food web. The seasonal cycles of the lake ecosystem influenced every aspect of chinampa agriculture. During the rainy season, increased water flow brought fresh nutrients from the surrounding mountains while also carrying away accumulated salts and waste products. The rising water levels during this period provided optimal growing conditions for many crops, while the increased biological activity in the warming waters accelerated nutrient cycling throughout the system. Dry season conditions created different opportunities and challenges for the chinampa ecosystem. Lower water levels concentrated nutrients in the remaining water, while cooler temperatures slowed biological processes and reduced evaporation rates. Many plants adapted to these seasonal changes by adjusting their growth patterns, with some species thriving during the dry months while others remained dormant until the return of the rains. The management of biodiversity within the chinampa system required sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships. Farmers learned to encourage beneficial species while controlling those that might damage crops or compete with desired plants. This management was typically accomplished through habitat modification rather than direct intervention, creating conditions that favored helpful organisms while making the environment less suitable for pests and weeds. Pollinator populations were carefully maintained within the chinampa communities, as these insects were essential for the reproduction of many cultivated crops. Native bees, butterflies, and other pollinating insects found abundant food sources in the diverse plant communities of the gardens, while farmers provided nesting sites and protection from disturbance. The result was a stable pollinator population that ensured reliable crop production year after year. Predator-prey relationships within the chinampa ecosystem helped maintain natural balance without requiring external inputs of pesticides or other controls. Spiders, predatory insects, small mammals, and birds all contributed to pest control by consuming harmful organisms before they could reach damaging population levels. Farmers learned to recognize and protect these beneficial predators, understanding their crucial role in maintaining agricultural productivity. The integration of livestock into the chinampa system added another layer of ecological complexity. Ducks and other waterfowl were often raised in and around the gardens, where they consumed aquatic insects and plants while contributing fertilizer through their droppings. These birds also provided eggs and meat for human consumption, making efficient use of resources that might otherwise have been wasted. Economic and social impact. The economic impact of the chinampa system extended far beyond simple food production, creating complex networks of trade, specialization, and wealth that supported the growth and prosperity of the Aztec Empire. The high productivity of the floating gardens generated agricultural surpluses that could support large, non-agricultural populations, enabling the development of sophisticated urban centers, specialized crafts, and complex governmental systems. Agricultural productivity on the chinampas was remarkably high by pre-industrial standards, with some estimates suggesting that yields per unit area were comparable to those achieved by modern intensive farming methods. This exceptional productivity resulted from the combination of rich soils, optimal water availability, intensive cultivation techniques, and sophisticated crop management practices developed over generations of experimentation and refinement. The surplus production generated by chinampa agriculture supported extensive trade networks that connected the Valley of Mexico with distant regions. Throughout Mesoamerica, agricultural products from the floating gardens were traded for goods that could not be produced locally, including precious stones, tropical feathers, marine shells, and specialized manufactured items. These trade relationships strengthened political alliances and spread Aztec influence throughout the region. Labor organization within the chinampa system reflected the hierarchical structure of Aztec society while also incorporating elements of cooperative community management. Large chinampa complexes were often owned by noble families or institutions who employed tenant farmers or agricultural workers to manage day-to-day operations. However, many smaller gardens were owned and operated by individual families, creating a mixed economy that provided opportunities for both employment and independent entrepreneurship. The taxation system of the Aztec Empire relied heavily on agricultural tribute from chinampa producers, with farmers required to deliver specified quantities of crops to government storehouses at regular intervals. This tribute system provided the economic foundation for the extensive governmental bureaucracy, military forces, and public works projects that characterized Aztec civilization. The reliability and predictability of chinampa production made it possible for administrators to plan complex undertakings with confidence in their resource base. Specialization within chinampa agriculture led to the development of distinct production zones that focused on particular crops or agricultural techniques. Some areas became known for their exceptional maize production, while others specialized in flowers, vegetables, or medicinal plants. This regional specialization increased overall efficiency while creating opportunities for farmers to develop expertise in particular aspects of cultivation. The social stratification of Aztec society was reflected in the organization and ownership of chinampa lands. The most productive and well-located gardens were typically controlled by noble families, while commoners might own smaller, less advantageous plots or work as tenant farmers on land owned by others. However, the skill and knowledge required for successful chinampa agriculture provided opportunities for social advancement as exceptionally productive farmers could achieve recognition and improved status within their communities. Educational systems within chinampa communities focused heavily on the transmission of agricultural knowledge, with formal and informal training programs that ensured the continuation of sophisticated farming techniques. Young people learned not only practical skills but also the theoretical knowledge underlying successful cultivation, including understanding of soil chemistry, plant biology, weather patterns, and market dynamics. The integration of chinampa agriculture with urban development created unique economic relationships between rural producers and city dwellers. The proximity of the floating gardens to major population centers meant that fresh produce could be delivered to markets quickly, maintaining high quality and commanding premium prices. This geographic advantage gave chinampa farmers significant competitive benefits over producers from more distant agricultural regions. Financial systems within the Aztec economy accommodated the particular Characteristics of Chinampa agriculture, with lending arrangements, investment partnerships, and insurance-like risk-sharing agreements that reflected the seasonal nature of agricultural production and the substantial capital investments required for garden construction and maintenance. These financial innovations supported the expansion of Chinampa agriculture and enabled farmers to undertake large-scale improvements to their operations. Technological innovations and tools. The tools and technologies employed in Chinampa agriculture represented centuries of gradual refinement and adaptation to the unique requirements of wetland farming. These implements were designed specifically for use in the aquatic environment of the floating gardens, incorporating features that maximized efficiency while accommodating the challenges of working in and around water. The basic hand tools used by Chinampa farmers were variations of implements used throughout Mesoamerica, but modified for the specific conditions of wetland agriculture. The COA, a long-handled digging stick with a broad, flat blade, was the primary tool for soil cultivation and sediment collection. Chinampa versions of the COA were typically longer than those used in dryland farming, allowing farmers to work from the edges of gardens or from canoes without having to wade into the water unnecessarily. Specialized scooping tools were developed for the collection and transport of lake sediments during Chinampa construction and maintenance. These implements, carved from single pieces of wood or constructed from materials like turtle shells, were designed to lift and carry large quantities of organic rich mud while allowing excess water to drain away. The shape and size of these tools were carefully optimized for efficiency, reducing the labor required for the intensive process of building up garden soils. Water management tools included various types of channels, dams, and flow control devices that allowed farmers to regulate water levels within their gardens. Simple wooden boards could be inserted into channels to create temporary dams, while more permanent structures used stone and organic materials to direct water flow according to seasonal needs. These water control systems required minimal maintenance while providing precise management of moisture levels throughout the growing season. Harvesting tools were adapted to accommodate the high productivity and intensive cultivation methods of Chinampa agriculture. Specialized baskets and containers were designed to be lightweight and waterproof, allowing farmers to transport crops efficiently through the canal networks. These containers were often woven from local materials like cattail reeds and sealed with natural waterproofing agents to protect their contents during transport. Transportation technology centered around the development of specialized canoes and boats adapted to the shallow, narrow waterways of the Chinampa system. These vessels were typically narrow and stable, designed for easy maneuvering in confined spaces while carrying maximum loads of crops or materials. The construction techniques for these boats incorporated traditional woodworking methods with innovations specific to the requirements of wetland transportation. Measurement and planning tools helped farmers design and maintain their gardens with precision. Simple measuring devices made from wood and rope allowed for accurate layout of garden plots and canal systems, while observational tools helped farmers monitor water levels, soil conditions, and crop development. These instruments were typically made from readily available materials but reflected sophisticated understanding of engineering and agricultural principles. Storage and preservation technologies were essential for maintaining the quality of crops after harvest, particularly given the high moisture levels in the Chinampa environment. Specialized granaries and storage containers were designed to protect stored crops from humidity while preventing spoilage and pest damage. These storage systems often incorporated natural materials with pest repellent properties, such as certain types of clay or plant-based compounds. Processing tools allowed farmers to prepare their crops for consumption or trade immediately after harvest. Stone grinding implements for processing maize and other grains were common, while specialized tools for cleaning, sorting, and preparing various crops helped maximize the value of agricultural production. Many of these tools were designed for use in the humid environment of the Chinampas, incorporating features that prevented rust or decay. Construction tools used in building and maintaining the Chinampas themselves included various implements for moving earth, shaping soil, and installing structural elements like willow posts. These tools needed to be effective when used in wet conditions while being light enough for transport by canoe. The Design of construction tools reflected deep understanding of soil mechanics and structural engineering adapted to the unique challenges of building in aquatic environments. Maintenance tools were essential for the ongoing care of established chinampas, including implements for weed control, soil cultivation, and structural repair. These tools were typically designed for frequent use and needed to be durable enough to withstand the corrosive effects of constant exposure to moisture. Many maintenance tools incorporated ergonomic features that reduced fatigue during long days of agricultural work. Seasonal cycles and agricultural calendar. The agricultural calendar of the Chinampa system was intricately synchronized with the natural rhythms of the Valley of Mexico, creating a complex annual cycle that optimized productivity while working within the constraints and opportunities provided by seasonal climate variations. This calendar represented the accumulated wisdom of generations of farmers who had carefully observed and recorded the relationships between weather patterns, water levels, soil conditions, and crop performance. The dry season, extending roughly from November through April, marked the beginning of the agricultural year for many Chinampa crops. During these months, cooler temperatures and lower humidity created optimal conditions for seed germination and early plant growth, while reduced water levels made it easier to access garden areas for planting and cultivation activities. The stable weather patterns of the dry season allowed farmers to plan and execute complex planting schedules with confidence. December and January were typically devoted to soil preparation and the planting of cool season crops. Farmers would spend long days cultivating their garden plots, incorporating composted organic matter and adjusting soil levels to ensure optimal growing conditions. The cool, dry air of these months was ideal for working in the gardens, while the lower insect populations reduced pest pressure on newly planted crops. February and March marked the peak planting season for many of the major food crops grown on the Chinampas. Maize varieties adapted to the local growing conditions were planted in carefully planned sequences that would ensure continuous harvests throughout the growing season. Bean and squash plantings were coordinated with the maize crops to create the productive polyculture systems that characterized Chinampa agriculture. April brought the first signs of the approaching rainy season, with increasing temperatures and occasional light showers that helped establish newly planted crops. This transitional month required careful attention from farmers, as changing weather conditions could dramatically affect crop development. Experienced farmers used subtle environmental cues to time their final dry season plantings and prepare for the dramatic changes that would come with the rains. The onset of the rainy season in May transformed the entire Chinampa landscape, bringing both opportunities and challenges that required significant adjustments to agricultural practices. Rising water levels increased the availability of nutrients, while also raising the risk of flooding in low-lying garden areas. The dramatic increase in humidity and temperature accelerated plant growth but also increased pressure from pests and diseases. June through August constituted the heart of the growing season, when the combination of warm temperatures, abundant moisture, and long daylight hours created optimal conditions for crop development. However, these months also required the most intensive management, as rapidly growing crops needed frequent attention to prevent problems from escalating into serious threats to productivity. The management of water levels during the rainy season required constant vigilance and frequent adjustments to drainage systems and flow control structures. Farmers needed to balance the benefits of increased moisture availability against the risks of waterlogging and root rot that could destroy crops if water levels rose too high. This balancing act required deep understanding of both crop physiology and hydrological principles. September and October brought the main harvest season for many Chinampa crops, creating periods of intense activity as farmers worked to gather mature crops before the onset of cooler weather. The timing of harvest activities was critical, as crops needed to be collected at peak ripeness to maximize both quantity and quality. The coordination of harvest activities often involved entire communities working together to ensure that all crops were gathered efficiently. The transition back to dry season conditions in November required another major adjustment in agricultural practices, as farmers shifted from the intensive cultivation activities of the growing season to the more deliberate tasks of soil preparation, infrastructure maintenance, and planning for the following year. This period provided opportunities for reflection and evaluation, as farmers assessed the success of their previous season's efforts and planned improvements for the future. Winter months were devoted to infrastructure maintenance and improvement, projects that were difficult to accomplish during the busy growing season. Farmers used this quieter period to repair and expand their garden areas, construct new chinampas, and renovate canal systems. The cooler, drier conditions of winter made these construction activities more comfortable while providing stable working conditions that facilitated precise work. The annual cycle of chinampa agriculture also incorporated numerous cultural and religious observances that were closely tied to agricultural activities. Planting and harvest festivals provided opportunities for communities to come together in celebration while also serving practical purposes such as coordinating community-wide activities and sharing information about successful techniques. Challenges and environmental pressures. Despite their remarkable success and sustainability, the chinampa systems faced numerous challenges and environmental pressures that required constant adaptation and management by the farming communities. These challenges ranged from natural environmental fluctuations to human-induced changes that threatened the delicate balance of the wetland agricultural ecosystem. Seasonal flooding represented one of the most significant and recurring challenges faced by chinampa farmers. During years when rainfall was particularly heavy or when runoff from the surrounding mountains was unusually high, water levels in the lakes could rise dramatically, threatening to submerge even well-constructed gardens. Farmers developed various strategies for coping with flood conditions, including temporary raising of garden surfaces and the construction of emergency drainage channels. Drought conditions posed the opposite but equally serious threat to chinampa agriculture. During periods when rainfall was insufficient or when water sources upstream were diverted or depleted, the lake levels could drop dramatically, leaving gardens high and dry. The sophisticated water management systems developed by chinampa farmers included various methods for conserving and redistributing available water during drought periods. Soil salinity presented an ongoing challenge in many parts of the chinampa system, particularly in areas where the underlying lake water had high mineral content. The accumulation of salts in garden soils could dramatically reduce crop productivity and even make some areas unsuitable for cultivation. Farmers developed techniques for managing soil salinity through careful water management, soil amendment, and crop selection strategies. Pest and disease pressures intensified as chinampa agriculture became more intensive and widespread. The concentration of crops in the limited area of the floating gardens created ideal conditions for the rapid spread of agricultural pests, while the warm, humid conditions of the lake environment favored the development of various plant diseases. Farmers responded to these challenges through integrated pest management strategies that combined cultural practices, biological controls, and careful monitoring. Wind and storm damage represented another significant environmental challenge, particularly during the rainy season when severe weather was most common. Strong winds could damage crops directly while also causing erosion of garden surfaces and disruption of water management systems. The design of chinampa layouts and the selection of protective vegetation were influenced by the need to minimize wind damage while maintaining productive capacity. Water quality issues became increasingly problematic as human populations in the Valley of Mexico grew and industrial activities expanded. Pollution from urban areas and from intensive agricultural activities could degrade the water quality in the lake systems, affecting both the health of crops and the sustainability of the overall ecosystem. These problems required adaptive management strategies and sometimes necessitated the abandonment of previously productive areas. Invasive species introductions, both plant and animal, posed threats to the carefully balanced ecosystems of the chinampa systems. Non-native plants could outcompete desirable species and disrupt established ecological relationships, while introduced animals might consume crops or prey on beneficial organisms. The management of invasive species required constant vigilance and sometimes significant modifications to traditional farming practices. Climate variability and long-term climate change created broader challenges that affected the entire chinampa system. Extended periods of unusual weather patterns could disrupt the seasonal rhythms on which agricultural planning depended, while gradual shifts in temperature or precipitation patterns might require fundamental changes to crop selection and cultivation techniques. Competition for water resources intensified as population growth and urban development increased demand for fresh water throughout the Valley of Mexico. The diversion of water for urban uses could significantly affect lake levels and water quality, forcing chinampa farmers to adapt their practices to changing hydrological conditions. These conflicts over water rights became increasingly complex as different user groups competed for limited resources. Soil erosion and sedimentation problems could affect both individual gardens and the broader canal systems that connected them. Excessive erosion could destroy established gardens, while sedimentation could clog waterways and disrupt transportation networks. The prevention and management of erosion required careful attention to vegetation management and soil conservation practices. Economic pressures from changing market conditions and political instability could also threaten the viability of chinampa agriculture. Farmers needed to balance the requirements of sustainable agricultural practices with the immediate economic pressures of supporting their families and meeting tribute obligations. These economic challenges sometimes forced farmers to adopt practices that prioritized short-term productivity over long-term sustainability. Cultural and religious significance. The chinampas held profound cultural and religious significance within Aztec society, representing far more than simply an efficient method of food production. These floating gardens were intimately connected to fundamental aspects of Aztec cosmology, mythology, and spiritual practice, embodying the complex relationships between humans, nature, and the divine that characterized pre-Columbian Mesoamerican worldviews. In Aztec mythology, the creation of the world involved the establishment of order from primordial chaos, with the gods bringing forth land from the waters of creation. The chinampas, as artificial islands created from the waters of the great lakes, symbolically recreated this primordial act of creation, making each garden a microcosm of the ordered universe. This cosmological significance imbued chinampa agriculture with sacred meaning that transcended its practical functions. The agricultural calendar of the chinampas was closely integrated with the complex ceremonial calendar of the Aztec religion, with specific rituals and offerings associated with different phases of the growing cycle. Planting ceremonies invoked the blessings of Tlaloc, the rain god, and other deities associated with fertility and agriculture, while harvest festivals celebrated the successful completion of the growing cycle and expressed gratitude for the bounty provided by the gods. Xochiquetzal, the goddess of flowers, love, and beauty, held special significance for chinampa farmers who cultivated the ornamental plants that played important roles in Aztec religious ceremonies. The floating gardens were major sources of the flowers used in temple decorations, religious festivals, and personal adornment, connecting the agricultural activities of the farmers directly to the spiritual life of the broader community. The concept of reciprocity, fundamental to Aztec religious and social thought, was embodied in the relationship between humans and the chinampa ecosystem. Farmers understood their role as caretakers and partners with the natural world, responsible for maintaining the balance and fertility of the system through their careful attention and appropriate ritual observances. This reciprocal relationship extended to the spiritual realm, where human offerings and ceremonies were understood to sustain the divine forces that ensured agricultural success. Water held particular sacred significance in Aztec religion, viewed as a life-giving force that connected the terrestrial world with both the heavens and the underworld. The chinampas, surrounded by and dependent upon water, were seen as sacred spaces where these cosmic forces converged. Ritual purification and blessing of water sources were important elements of chinampa management, ensuring that the spiritual as well as physical qualities of the water remained conducive to agricultural success. The cyclical nature of chinampa agriculture reflected broader Aztec concepts of time and cosmology, which emphasized the repetitive cycles of creation, destruction, and renewal that governed both natural and supernatural worlds. The annual cycle of planting, growth, harvest, and fallow periods on the chinampas mirrored the larger cosmic cycles that the Aztecs believed determined the fate of the universe. Ceremonial consumption of crops grown on the chinampas formed an important element of religious practice, with specific foods associated with particular deities and ritual occasions. Maize, as the fundamental crop of chinampa agriculture, was particularly sacred, believed to be the substance from which humans themselves had been created by the gods. The preparation and consumption of maize-based foods carried deep spiritual significance that connected daily sustenance with fundamental religious beliefs. The aesthetics of chinampa agriculture, particularly the cultivation of flowers and ornamental plants, reflected Aztec values regarding beauty, harmony, and the proper relationship between humans and nature. The visual impact of the floating gardens, with their geometric patterns and colorful displays, was understood to please the gods while also providing spiritual satisfaction to human observers. Educational and initiatory practices within chinampa communities often incorporated religious and spiritual elements alongside practical training in agricultural techniques. Young people learning to become farmers were taught not only the technical skills required for successful cultivation but also the ritual knowledge and spiritual perspectives necessary for maintaining proper relationships with the divine forces that governed agricultural success. The integration of art and craft production with chinampa agriculture created additional layers of cultural significance, as farmers produced not only food but also the raw materials for textiles, basketry, and other crafts that were essential elements of Aztec material culture. The flowers, fibers, and dyes produced on the chinampas were transformed into objects that carried cultural meaning and spiritual significance throughout Aztec society. Divination and prognostication practices were closely associated with chinampa agriculture, with experienced farmers serving as informal priests who could interpret natural signs and omens that might affect agricultural success. The observation of weather patterns, animal behavior, and plant development provided information that was understood to reflect the intentions and moods of the agricultural deities. The Spanish conquest and colonial period. The arrival of Spanish conquistadors in the Valley of Mexico in 1519 marked the beginning of a dramatic transformation that would fundamentally alter the chinampa agricultural system and the society it supported. The initial encounter between Spanish forces and the Aztec Empire created immediate disruptions to agricultural production, but the long-term impacts of colonization would prove far more devastating to the traditional farming practices of the floating gardens. The siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 directly threatened the chinampa system, as military activities disrupted normal agricultural routines and damaged garden infrastructure. Spanish forces, seeking to isolate the city and force its surrender, may have deliberately targeted agricultural areas to undermine the food supply of the defenders. The psychological impact of warfare also affected farming communities, as uncertainty about the future made long-term agricultural planning impossible. Following the conquest, Spanish colonial administrators initially recognized the productivity and importance of the chinampa system, understanding that maintaining agricultural production was essential for the stability of their new territory. However, their lack of understanding of the complex ecological and social relationships that made the system function led to policies and interventions that gradually undermined its effectiveness. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish colonists control over indigenous communities and their labor, disrupted the traditional social organization of chinampa agriculture. Farmers who had previously worked their own land or participated in cooperative community arrangements found themselves required to provide labor and tribute to Spanish overseers who had little understanding of wetland farming techniques. Colonial land tenure policies fundamentally altered the ownership and management of chinampa lands. Spanish legal concepts of individual property ownership conflicted with traditional indigenous systems of communal land management, leading to confusion, disputes, and the gradual concentration of productive lands in the hands of Spanish colonists and their descendants. The introduction of European crops and farming techniques created new pressures on the chinampa system, as colonial administrators encouraged or required farmers to grow wheat, barley, and other Old World crops that were poorly suited to wetland agriculture. These crops often failed in chinampa conditions, reducing overall productivity while disrupting traditional crop rotation systems that had maintained soil fertility for generations. Demographic collapse among indigenous populations, caused by epidemic diseases introduced by Europeans, devastated chinampa communities and eliminated much of the traditional knowledge required for successful wetland agriculture. The loss of experienced farmers and the breakdown of community-based knowledge transmission systems made it increasingly difficult to maintain the sophisticated techniques that the chinampa system required. Changes in water management policies under colonial rule often favored Spanish urban centers and industrial activities over indigenous agricultural needs. The diversion of water for mining operations, urban supply systems, and European-style agriculture reduced the water available for chinampa cultivation while also affecting water quality in the remaining lake systems. The Spanish colonial economy's emphasis on export crops and monetary exchange disrupted the traditional subsistence focus of chinampa agriculture. Farmers found themselves under pressure to produce crops for distant markets rather than for local consumption, leading to changes in cultivation practices that prioritized quantity over sustainability and long-term soil health. Religious conversion efforts by Spanish missionaries created additional pressures on chinampa communities, as traditional agricultural ceremonies and spiritual practices were suppressed or transformed. The loss of indigenous religious practices that had been intimately connected to agricultural cycles disrupted the cultural framework that had supported sustainable farming practices for centuries. Despite these pressures, many chinampa communities adapted to colonial conditions and continued to practice modified versions of traditional agriculture. Throughout the colonial period, some farmers successfully integrated new crops and techniques with traditional methods, creating hybrid systems that maintained productivity while accommodating colonial demands. The gradual urbanization of the Valley of Mexico during the colonial period placed increasing pressure on remaining chinampa areas as growing cities expanded into agricultural lands and increased demand for urban services like roads and housing. This urban expansion often occurred with little regard for the ecological functions of wetland areas or the agricultural value of chinampa lands. Documentation of chinampa agriculture during the colonial period was often incomplete or biased, as Spanish observers frequently misunderstood or dismissed indigenous farming techniques as primitive or inefficient. This lack of accurate documentation contributed to the loss of traditional knowledge and made it more difficult for later generations to appreciate the sophistication of pre-Columbian agricultural systems. Colonial tax and tribute systems placed additional economic burdens on chinampa farmers, who were required to provide agricultural products or labor to support Spanish administrative and religious institutions. These obligations often conflicted with the seasonal rhythms of agricultural work, forcing farmers to choose between meeting colonial demands and maintaining their traditional farming practices. Modern transformations and urban development. The transformation of the Valley of Mexico from a system of interconnected lakes to a largely urbanized landscape represents one of the most dramatic environmental changes in human history, with profound implications for the surviving remnants of the ancient chinampa system. This transformation, which accelerated dramatically during the 20th century, fundamentally altered the ecological context in which the floating gardens had thrived for over 1,000 years. The drainage of Lake Texcoco, begun during the colonial period but intensified during the 19th and 20th centuries, eliminated the largest body of water in the valley system and dramatically altered regional hydrology. This massive engineering project, intended to prevent flooding in Mexico City and provide land for urban expansion, removed millions of gallons of water from the ecosystem that had supported chinampa agriculture. Urbanization pressures throughout the 20th century consumed vast areas of former chinampa lands, as Mexico City expanded to become one of the world's largest metropolitan areas. Housing developments, industrial facilities, and infrastructure projects often built directly over former garden areas, permanently eliminating centuries of accumulated agricultural knowledge and infrastructure. Water pollution from urban and industrial sources degraded the quality of remaining water bodies, making traditional chinampa agriculture increasingly difficult or impossible in many areas. Chemical contamination, sewage discharge, and industrial waste created conditions that were harmful to both crops and the farmers who tended them, forcing the abandonment of previously productive areas. The introduction of modern transportation systems, including highways, railways, and airports, fragmented remaining chinampa areas and disrupted traditional patterns of movement and communication between farming communities. These infrastructure projects often bisected historical garden areas, making integrated management of larger systems impossible. Climate change effects, including altered precipitation patterns and increased temperature variability, have created new challenges for the management of surviving chinampa systems. Traditional agricultural calendars, developed over centuries of observation and experience, may no longer provide reliable guidance for planting and harvesting decisions in the altered climate of the modern era. Despite these challenges, some chinampa areas have survived and even thrived in the modern period, particularly in the southern reaches of the valley where urbanization has been less intensive and water quality has remained relatively good. These surviving areas, primarily located in Xochimilco and surrounding communities, continue to practice modified versions of traditional agriculture while adapting to contemporary economic and environmental conditions. The recognition of chinampas as UNESCO World Heritage Sites has brought international attention to their cultural and agricultural significance, leading to increased efforts to preserve and protect remaining areas. This recognition has also supported research and documentation efforts that have helped recover some traditional knowledge that had been lost during the colonial and early modern periods. Tourism development in surviving chinampa areas has created new economic opportunities for local communities while also presenting challenges related to environmental protection and cultural preservation. The management of tourist activities requires careful balancing of economic benefits against potential impacts on agricultural production and ecosystem health. Modern agricultural techniques and inputs have been gradually integrated into chinampa farming, with mixed results for productivity and sustainability. Chemical fertilizers and pesticides can increase short-term yields but may also disrupt the ecological relationships that traditionally maintained soil fertility and pest control in the floating garden systems. Educational and research institutions have played increasingly important roles in studying and preserving chinampa agriculture, documenting traditional techniques, while also investigating possibilities for adapting these methods to contemporary conditions. These efforts have contributed to growing recognition of the potential value of traditional agricultural knowledge for addressing modern food security and environmental challenges. Government policies at local, national, and international levels have increasingly recognized the importance of protecting remaining chinampa areas, though implementation and enforcement of protective measures remain challenging. The complexity of managing agricultural landscapes within urban environments requires coordination between multiple agencies and stakeholders with sometimes conflicting interests. The development of ecotourism and educational programs in chinampa areas has helped raise awareness of their historical and ecological significance while providing economic incentives for conservation. These programs often involve collaboration between local farmers, educational institutions, and tourism operators to create sustainable economic models that support both conservation and community development. Contemporary conservation efforts. Contemporary conservation efforts focused on preserving and revitalizing chinampa agriculture represent a complex intersection of cultural preservation, environmental protection, and sustainable development goals. These initiatives, undertaken by a diverse array of organizations and individuals, seek to maintain the viability of traditional farming systems while adapting them to the realities of the modern world. Academic institutions have played crucial roles in documenting and studying surviving chinampa systems, conducting research that has helped recover traditional knowledge while also investigating the potential applications of chinampa techniques in contemporary agriculture. Universities and research centers have established long-term monitoring programs that track environmental conditions, agricultural productivity, and social changes in chinampa communities. International development organizations have recognized chinampas as examples of sustainable agriculture that could provide models for addressing food security and environmental challenges in other parts of the world. These organizations have supported conservation efforts through funding, technical assistance, and knowledge-sharing initiatives that connect chinampa farmers with other practitioners of sustainable agriculture globally. Local community organizations have emerged as key drivers of conservation efforts, working to maintain traditional farming practices while also advocating for Policies that protect chinampa lands from urban development and environmental degradation. These grassroots organizations often serve as bridges between traditional farming communities and external institutions interested in supporting conservation efforts. Government agencies at various levels have implemented policies and programs designed to protect chinampa areas, though the effectiveness of these efforts has been limited by competing development pressures and resource constraints. Zoning regulations, environmental protection laws, and agricultural support programs have provided some protection for surviving chinampa areas while also creating frameworks for sustainable development. The integration of modern technology with traditional farming practices has opened new possibilities for enhancing the productivity and sustainability of chinampa agriculture. GPS mapping, soil testing, water quality monitoring, and other technological tools can provide farmers with detailed information about their growing conditions while also supporting research and conservation efforts. Educational programs targeting both local communities and broader audiences have helped raise awareness of the value and significance of chinampa agriculture. Schools, museums, and cultural centers have developed curricula and exhibits that teach about traditional farming methods while also highlighting their potential relevance for addressing contemporary challenges. Economic development initiatives have sought to create market incentives for maintaining chinampa agriculture through premium pricing for traditionally grown products, development of specialty markets, and support for value-added processing activities. These efforts recognize that conservation efforts must provide viable economic alternatives to farmers who might otherwise abandon traditional practices. Cultural preservation efforts have focused on maintaining the traditional knowledge, practices, and social institutions that support chinampa agriculture. These initiatives often involve working with elderly community members to document traditional techniques and cultural practices before this knowledge is lost to urbanization and social change. Environmental restoration projects have attempted to improve water quality, restore native vegetation, and re-establish ecological processes that support healthy chinampa ecosystems. These efforts often require coordination between multiple agencies and stakeholders, as environmental problems frequently extend beyond the boundaries of individual garden areas. International recognition and support have provided important validation for conservation efforts while also creating opportunities for knowledge exchange and collaboration with other traditional agricultural systems around the world. UNESCO designation and other forms of international recognition have helped attract funding and technical support for conservation initiatives. Climate change adaptation strategies are increasingly being integrated into chinampa conservation efforts, recognizing that traditional farming systems will need to adapt to changing environmental conditions while maintaining their essential characteristics. These adaptation efforts often involve developing new crop varieties, modifying water management techniques, and adjusting planting schedules to accommodate changing climate patterns. The development of sustainable tourism models has provided economic incentives for conservation while also creating opportunities for education and cultural exchange. Well-managed tourism can generate income for farming communities while also raising awareness of the value of traditional agricultural systems among visitors from around the world. Policy advocacy efforts have focused on creating regulatory frameworks that protect chinampa areas while also supporting the communities that maintain them. These efforts often involve complex negotiations between development interests, environmental groups, agricultural communities, and government agencies with different priorities and perspectives. Scientific and agricultural legacy. The scientific and agricultural legacy of the chinampa system extends far beyond its historical significance, offering valuable insights and techniques that remain relevant to contemporary challenges in sustainable agriculture, food security, and environmental management. Modern researchers and practitioners continue to study and adapt chinampa principles, recognizing their potential contributions to addressing 21st-century agricultural and environmental challenges. The principles of integrated pest management developed by chinampa farmers centuries ago anticipated many of the strategies now advocated by contemporary sustainable agriculture movements. The careful management of beneficial insects, birds, and other organisms to control agricultural pests represents a sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships that modern organic farming movements are still working to fully implement. Soil fertility management techniques employed in chinampa agriculture demonstrate principles of nutrient cycling and organic matter management that remain fundamental to sustainable farming systems. The careful composting of organic materials, the integration of nitrogen-fixing plants, and the maintenance of soil structure through organic amendments represent practices that modern, sustainable agriculture advocates continue to promote and refine. Water management innovations developed for chinampa agriculture offer valuable lessons for contemporary irrigation and water conservation efforts. The precise control of water levels, the efficient use of available water resources, and the integration of water management with soil fertility enhancement represent techniques that could be adapted for use in modern agricultural systems facing water scarcity challenges. The polyculture systems practiced on chinampas demonstrate principles of crop diversification and companion planting that are increasingly recognized as important strategies for sustainable agriculture. The careful selection of compatible crops, the optimization of spatial arrangements, and the coordination of planting and harvesting schedules represent sophisticated approaches to maximizing productivity while maintaining ecological balance. Aquaculture integration techniques developed in chinampa systems offer models for contemporary efforts to combine fish farming with crop production. The management of fish populations to provide both protein and nutrients for crop production represents an approach to integrated agriculture that modern, sustainable farming systems are working to develop and refine. The biodiversity conservation achievements of chinampa agriculture provide examples of how intensive food production can be compatible with the maintenance of ecological diversity. The integration of wild plants, beneficial insects, birds, and other organisms into agricultural systems demonstrates approaches to farming that support rather than degrade natural ecosystems. Seed saving and plant breeding techniques developed by chinampa farmers represent valuable approaches to maintaining genetic diversity in crop plants, while also developing varieties adapted to specific local conditions. These traditional breeding methods offer alternatives to industrial agriculture's reliance on genetically uniform crop varieties that may be vulnerable to pests and diseases. Urban agriculture applications of chinampa principles are being explored in cities around the world, where space constraints and environmental challenges make traditional farming methods impractical. The intensive production methods, space-efficient layouts, and integration with urban water systems developed for chinampas offer models for contemporary urban farming initiatives. Climate adaptation strategies employed by chinampa farmers provide examples of how agricultural systems can maintain productivity despite environmental variability and change. The flexibility of planting schedules, the diversification of crops and varieties, and the integration of multiple production systems offer approaches to agricultural resilience that remain relevant in an era of climate change. Research methodologies developed through studies of chinampa agriculture have contributed to broader understanding of traditional ecological knowledge and its applications to contemporary environmental challenges. The interdisciplinary approaches required to understand chinampa systems have helped develop research methods that integrate social, ecological, and agricultural perspectives. Educational applications of chinampa studies have enriched curricula in agriculture, ecology, anthropology, and environmental studies, providing students with examples of how human societies can develop sustainable relationships with natural environments. These educational applications help prepare future researchers and practitioners to address contemporary sustainability challenges. The documentation and preservation of chinampa knowledge have contributed to broader efforts to maintain traditional ecological knowledge that might otherwise be lost to modernization and globalization. These preservation efforts recognize that traditional knowledge systems often contain valuable insights that can inform contemporary approaches to environmental management and sustainable development. International development applications of chinampa principles are being explored in regions where food security and environmental degradation present significant challenges. The adaptation of chinampa techniques to different ecological and social contexts offers possibilities for addressing agricultural and environmental Problems in diverse settings around the world, lessons for modern sustainable agriculture. The enduring relevance of chinampa agriculture for contemporary sustainable farming lies not in the direct replication of ancient techniques, but in the fundamental principles and approaches that guided their development and implementation. These principles offer valuable insights for modern agricultural systems seeking to balance productivity, sustainability, and environmental stewardship in an era of increasing resource constraints and environmental challenges. The integration of multiple production systems within chinampa agriculture demonstrates the value of diversified farming approaches that can provide multiple benefits while reducing overall system risks. Modern sustainable agriculture movements increasingly recognize the importance of integrating crop production with livestock, aquaculture, forestry, and other productive activities to create more resilient and efficient farming systems. The careful attention to soil health and fertility maintenance that characterized chinampa agriculture offers important lessons for contemporary efforts to maintain agricultural productivity without depleting natural resources. The emphasis on organic matter addition, nutrient cycling, and biological soil health represents approaches that modern sustainable farming systems are working to implement more widely. The sophisticated water management techniques developed for chinampa agriculture provide models for contemporary irrigation and water conservation efforts, particularly in regions where water resources are scarce or under increasing pressure from competing uses. The precise control of water applications, the efficient use of available water, and the integration of water management with other agricultural practices represent strategies that remain highly relevant. The ecological integration achieved in chinampa systems offers examples of how agricultural production can be designed to support rather than degrade natural ecosystems. The maintenance of biodiversity, the integration of beneficial organisms, and the creation of habitat for wildlife within productive agricultural landscapes represent approaches that contemporary sustainable agriculture movements are working to develop and implement. The community-based management systems that supported chinampas provide models for contemporary efforts to develop more participatory and locally appropriate approaches to agricultural development. The emphasis on local knowledge, community decision-making, and collaborative management represents approaches that can enhance both the effectiveness and sustainability of agricultural development initiatives. The long-term perspective that characterized chinampa agriculture offers important lessons for contemporary agricultural systems that often prioritize short-term productivity over long-term sustainability. The investment in soil building, infrastructure development, and knowledge accumulation that supported chinampas for centuries represents approaches to agricultural planning that could benefit modern farming systems. The innovation and adaptation that characterize chinampa development demonstrate the importance of continuous learning and improvement in agricultural systems. The willingness to experiment with new techniques, adapt to changing conditions, and incorporate new knowledge represents attitudes and approaches that remain essential for sustainable agriculture development. The integration of cultural and spiritual values with practical agricultural techniques in chinampa systems offers examples of how farming can be understood as more than simply economic production. The recognition of agriculture as a cultural practice that maintains relationships between people, communities, and natural environments represents perspectives that can enrich contemporary approaches to sustainable farming. The resilience demonstrated by chinampa systems over centuries of environmental and social changes provides examples of how agricultural systems can be designed to adapt to uncertainty and variability. The flexibility of production systems, the diversification of crops and techniques, and the maintenance of traditional knowledge represent strategies for building agricultural resilience that remain relevant in contemporary contexts. The economic sustainability achieved by chinampa agriculture offers lessons for contemporary efforts to develop farming systems that can provide adequate livelihoods for farmers while also meeting broader social and environmental goals. The integration of subsistence production with market-oriented activities, the development of value-added products, and the creation of multiple income streams represent economic strategies that remain relevant for sustainable agriculture development. Conclusion and reflections. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through the history of the Aztec floating gardens, we find ourselves contemplating a remarkable achievement of human ingenuity and environmental harmony that continues to offer insights and inspiration nearly 7 centuries after its peak development. The chinampa system represents far more than an ancient farming technique. It embodies a comprehensive approach to living sustainably within natural systems while meeting human needs for food, community, and cultural expression. The story of the chinampas reminds us that some of humanity's most sophisticated achievements have emerged not from dramatic technological breakthroughs, but from patient observation, careful experimentation, and gradual refinement of techniques over many generations. The farmers who developed and maintained these floating gardens worked within natural rhythms and processes, creating systems that enhanced rather than depleted the environments in which they operated. The longevity and productivity of chinampa agriculture demonstrate the possibility of creating human settlements and food systems that can sustain themselves for centuries without degrading their environmental foundations. This achievement offers hope and guidance for contemporary efforts to develop more sustainable approaches to agriculture and urban development in an era of increasing environmental challenges. The integration of social, cultural, and spiritual dimensions with practical agricultural techniques in chinampa systems illustrates the importance of understanding farming as more than simply economic production. The cultural practices, social institutions, and spiritual beliefs that supported chinampas were not separate from their agricultural functions but essential elements that contributed to their long-term success and sustainability. The resilience demonstrated by chinampa communities in adapting to environmental changes, social disruptions, and economic pressures provides examples of how human communities can maintain their essential characteristics, while also responding flexibly to changing circumstances. This adaptive capacity represents a crucial quality for contemporary communities facing rapid environmental and social changes. The loss of much traditional chinampa knowledge during the colonial period and subsequent centuries reminds us of the fragility of traditional knowledge systems, and the importance of efforts to document, preserve, and transmit this knowledge to future generations. The ongoing work of researchers, community organizations, and cultural institutions to maintain this knowledge represents an investment in humanity's collective understanding of sustainable agriculture and environmental management. The surviving chinampa areas in Mexico continue to evolve and adapt, incorporating new techniques and responding to contemporary challenges while maintaining their essential characteristics. These living laboratories provide opportunities for continued learning and experimentation that can inform broader efforts to develop sustainable agricultural systems. The international recognition and study of chinampa agriculture has contributed to growing appreciation for traditional ecological knowledge and its potential contributions to addressing contemporary environmental challenges. This recognition represents an important shift away from assumptions that modern techniques are inherently superior to traditional practices toward more nuanced understanding of the value of different approaches to environmental management. The principles and techniques developed through centuries of chinampa agriculture offer valuable resources for contemporary efforts to address food security, environmental degradation, and climate change challenges. While direct replication of ancient techniques may not always be appropriate or feasible, the underlying principles of ecological integration, resource efficiency, and long-term sustainability remain highly relevant. The story of the chinampas ultimately offers a vision of agriculture as a practice that can enhance rather than degrade natural environments while also supporting thriving human communities. This vision challenges assumptions about the inevitability of environmental trade-offs in agricultural development and suggests possibilities for creating food systems that serve both human needs and ecological health. As we conclude our exploration of this remarkable agricultural system, we are reminded that the most profound innovations often emerge from quiet, patient work that builds understanding and capability over long periods of time. The legacy of the Aztec floating gardens continues to inspire and inform efforts to create more sustainable and harmonious relationships between human communities and the natural environments that sustain them. In the gentle rhythm of water lapping against ancient garden edges, in the patient work of building soil from lake sediments, and in the careful coordination of Planting cycles with seasonal rhythms, we find timeless lessons about the possibilities for human creativity and environmental stewardship. These lessons, carried forward through centuries of change and adaptation, continue to offer guidance and inspiration for creating a more sustainable and equitable future. The chinampas remind us that some of humanity's greatest achievements are found not in conquest or domination, but in the quiet arts of cultivation, cooperation, and care. In this spirit, we end our journey through their history, carrying with us appreciation for the wisdom and dedication of the countless individuals who created and maintained these remarkable floating gardens, and hope for the continued application of their insights to the challenges and opportunities of our own time.